It was a chilly morning when the mansion's gates opened to let in a steady stream of luxury cars. The air felt heavy, though no one could quite say why. Inside, the grand hall had been prepared carefully over the past few days. Chairs were arranged neatly in rows, polished wood gleaming under soft lights. Fresh flowers, all white, lined the aisles, and the scent of lily filled the air. Every detail seemed perfect, the kind of perfection that was meant to hide pain and fear behind elegance. No one spoke much as they entered. Those attending were some of the wealthiest and most influential people anyone could imagine. Executives who controlled parts of the country's economy, lawyers who could sway the outcomes of massive deals, and family members who had known her all their lives. Everyone had their own thoughts, but all were united by the one truth that had been told to them. She was gone. Dead. No more. And the room carried that weight, silent but heavy. At the center of the room, a casket sat on a raised platform. It was simple in design, but expensive, the kind that could make even the most casual observer feel the gravity of the occasion. Her face was visible, calm and still, almost as if she were sleeping peacefully. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of pain, just the kind of quiet that came with the finality of death, or so everyone thought. Outside, the world continued on as usual. But inside, it felt like time had slowed down. Every footstep echoed in the high-ceilinged hall. The staff moved quietly, adjusting flowers, checking lighting, and whispering to each other only when necessary. They knew this was more than a funeral. It was a statement, a display of wealth, power, and control. And yet, among all this formality and preparation, someone noticed something that didn't fit. A janitor had been working in the building for over a decade. He had cleaned these halls countless times, wiped down the same floors, dusted the same shelves, and polished the same chairs. Most days, people didn't notice him, and he liked it that way. He had no reason to be noticed. He had no fortune, no influence. Yet, he had learned to see what others overlooked, to notice small details that often went unobserved. And this morning, as he quietly moved through the hall to prepare for the service, he noticed something that didn't feel right. He stopped near the casket, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement. He looked closely at her face, studied the way her chest moved, or rather, didn't move. He bent slightly, focusing on her hands, the way they rested on the edge of the casket. Something about the stillness seemed unusual, almost unnatural. It wasn't just that she was quiet, or that her breathing was slow. There was a faintness, a subtle motion he couldn't explain. He had seen death many times in his life, not directly, but enough to understand the signs. And these signs didn't match what he was seeing now. He moved a little closer, keeping his head low so no one could see him. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "That's not right. Something's wrong." But before he could do more than mutter the words, the hall began to fill with people. Family members arrived, their faces pale and tense. Lawyers and business associates followed, all dressed in black, all moving quietly as if their silence was part of the ritual. They nodded at each other politely, some murmuring condolences that seemed more rehearsed than heartfelt. The janitor took a step back, unsure if he should say anything. He had no authority here. If he spoke, no one might listen. They might dismiss him, as they had so many times before, because he was invisible. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling. He couldn't ignore the nagging thought that something important was being overlooked. Something that might matter more than wealth, more than power, more than everything in that room combined. The service began quietly. A few close family members stood near the casket, holding hands, their faces etched with grief. Others sat in the rows of chairs, some looking down, some staring straight ahead. There was a soft voice reading passages about life and the importance of remembering the good. Flowers were placed gently on the casket, one by one, as the janitor watched from a corner. The words being spoken felt distant to him. His mind was focused on her, on the tiny signs that didn't belong. Time seemed to stretch. The janitor noticed a slight movement near her eyelid. He blinked, thinking he must have imagined it. But then it happened again, a subtle twitch, so small most would miss it. He swallowed hard. Could it be possible? Could she really not be gone? He glanced around nervously. Everyone else was focused on the ritual, on their own thoughts, on the business they would have to deal with once the service was over. No one was paying attention to this tiny flicker of life. He wanted to speak up, but fear held him back. He didn't want to be thrown out or laughed at. Yet, as he stood there, he realized that fear wasn't important. What mattered was the truth. And if he didn't act, someone might lose their chance to save her. The thought of failing to do the right thing made his heart pound. The family began sharing memories. A younger relative spoke about her generosity, about the way she had helped people without ever seeking recognition. Others shared stories about her business accomplishments, the empire she had built from nothing. As they spoke, the janitor's eyes never left her. He noticed her fingers twitch again. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was no ordinary death. Something had gone terribly wrong. The staff around the hall moved with precision, offering tissues, adjusting chairs, keeping everything orderly. None of them noticed what he did. None of them saw what he saw. And none of them knew that the most important person in the room might still be alive. He realized he was alone in this knowledge, the only person who could act before it was too late. Finally, as the service moved toward its close, he made a decision. He would have to speak up. It didn't matter what others thought. It didn't matter if they dismissed him as a janitor or as someone imagining things. She was alive, or at least there was a chance she was. And that chance was worth risking everything. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the room press down on him. He walked toward the center, toward the casket, every step heavy with uncertainty. Eyes flicked toward him briefly, some wondering if he had something to do, others too absorbed in their own thoughts to notice. He reached the edge of the platform and leaned slightly over her, careful not to disturb the arrangement of flowers. "Excuse me," he said softly at first, then louder when no one responded. I think she's alive." The room froze. Conversations halted. A few heads turned in confusion. Some of the staff looked at him with irritation. How dare a janitor speak during such an important ceremony? But he didn't stop. He repeated himself, more insistently this time. "She's alive. She's not dead. Please, check her, please." For a few heart-stopping seconds, no one moved. Then the closest family member approached hesitantly, uncertain whether to believe this stranger or dismiss him immediately. A doctor in attendance was called over, initially skeptical. The janitor stayed near, his hands shaking, his eyes never leaving her face. The faint twitch happened again. This time more noticeable, almost like a quiet plea for help. The janitor's heart raced. He felt relief, fear, and hope all at once. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next moment, waiting for someone to act. That small hall, filled with wealth, power, and grief, suddenly felt fragile. All the careful planning, all the rituals, all the arrangements, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was life. One life, hanging by the thinnest of threads, waiting for someone to believe, to notice, to act. And the janitor had noticed. The hall felt heavier than ever now. A hush had fallen over the crowd, broken only by the janitor's voice repeating what he had seen. "She's alive. Someone check her." The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. For a moment, it seemed as though time had stopped. The polished floors reflected the pale light from the windows. The flowers smelled sharper, and the soft murmur of the crowd turned into nervous whispers. Everyone was watching, unsure what to do next. The family members closest to the casket froze. Some looked shocked, some angry, some bewildered. They had come to say goodbye, to honor her memory, to follow every step of a carefully prepared ritual. And now a janitor, someone who had never been part of their world, was challenging everything they believed. A few of the lawyers frowned and whispered to each other, clearly worried about what this interruption could mean. They were used to control, to knowing the outcome of every situation, and this was something no one could control. The janitor's voice trembled, but he stayed firm. "I've seen this before. I know what I'm saying. Please, someone check her now." His eyes never left her face. Every slight movement, every subtle sign of life made his heart race faster. He had no idea what would happen if they ignored him, but he knew one thing. If he stayed silent, the chance to save her would vanish. At first, no one moved. The room was full of people with influence, power, and authority, yet all of them hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, one of the family members, an older cousin, took a cautious step forward. His face was pale, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed the janitor. "What are you talking about?" She's gone," the doctor said. He stopped, his words cutting off as he noticed the intensity in the janitor's eyes. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't imagination. This was conviction. A young assistant finally ran to the front, calling for a doctor. The medical professional in attendance arrived quickly, a clipboard in hand, his face professional and calm. He looked down at the casket and raised an eyebrow at the janitor. "What is it? Is there a problem?" he asked politely, but with authority. The janitor didn't hesitate. He pointed at her face and whispered urgently, "Look closely. She's not dead. I can feel it. You need to check her now." The doctor knelt, examining her carefully. He touched her wrist gently, feeling for a pulse. The janitor held his breath, stepping closer to watch. The silence in the hall was deafening. Everyone, from the wealthiest executive to the youngest family member, waited. No one spoke. Even the staff, who had been bustling around, now stood frozen, unsure how to react. Then, the doctor straightened slightly, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. There is a faint pulse," he said carefully, almost in disbelief. The words spread like wildfire. The whispers became louder, the tension in the room growing. People stepped back, some gasping, others holding their hands over their mouths. The realization hit slowly, painfully. They had almost buried her alive. The janitor felt his knees go weak, relief flooding him in waves. But he couldn't stop now. He had to make sure she was safe. "Call for the ambulance," he shouted, louder than before. "She needs help immediately." The assistants scrambled to follow orders, the phones ringing, people moving quickly for the first time in hours. Security tried to keep the crowd under control, but there was a chaos they had never experienced. Not because of an accident or a threat, but because a life had been saved at the last possible moment. The family rushed closer, some holding back tears, some looking guilty, some angry at the doctors for failing to notice. Questions flew fast and sharp. "How is this possible? Why didn't anyone see it? We could have lost her." The janitor stayed near the casket, quiet now, letting the professionals take charge. He could see the life returning slowly in her face, small movements, a faint flutter of her eyelids. She was fragile, weak, but alive. And that was all that mattered. As the ambulance arrived, paramedics moved quickly, carefully lifting her onto a stretcher. The janitor followed at a distance, unsure if he was allowed, but unwilling to leave her side. Family members moved with the paramedics, some holding hands, others murmuring prayers. The room, once filled with quiet grief and polite ceremonies, was now chaotic, alive with movement and tension. The truth had shattered the ritual, and no one could ignore it. In the aftermath, the hall emptied slowly. Guests left in shock, some whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. News would spread quickly, the story impossible to keep quiet. Lawyers muttered about the implications for the estate. Executives wondered how this mistake might affect their businesses, and family members were left with a mixture of relief and guilt. The janitor walked quietly behind the stretcher, unnoticed by most, but fully aware that his life had changed forever. He had stepped out of the shadows and done something no one else had dared to do. At the hospital, she was immediately taken to a private room. Monitors beeped softly, her breathing stabilized, and the doctors moved with precision to check her condition. The janitor was asked to step back, but he stayed nearby, watching through the glass. Every small rise and fall of her chest made his heart race with relief. She was alive. That simple truth was enough to erase the fear and uncertainty that had gripped him earlier. As the hours passed, her condition stabilized further. Doctors explained the situation to the family and the attending staff. She had been in a rare medical state that mimicked death. Her vital signs had been nearly undetectable to anyone who wasn't paying extremely close attention. The medical team admitted that it had been an unusual case, something that rarely happened, but could happen. It was a miracle that someone had noticed. It was a miracle that someone had acted. The family turned to the janitor, who had remained calm but insistent throughout. They looked at him with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. You saved her life," one of them said quietly, almost unable to believe the words themselves. He nodded, humble, almost embarrassed by the attention. He hadn't done it for praise or recognition. He had done it because he saw something that didn't feel right, and he couldn't ignore it. Word of the incident spread quickly outside the hospital. Journalists and media outlets caught wind of the story, intrigued by the bizarre twist. How had a billionaire, believed to be dead, been saved at the last moment by someone no one noticed? The janitor, once invisible, became a quiet hero overnight. Interviews, news articles, and social media posts celebrated his quick thinking and courage. People marveled at the idea that someone so ordinary, so overlooked, could make such a profound difference. Back at the mansion, the once prepared funeral hall felt empty and hollow. The flowers remained untouched, chairs still in place, but the ceremony had lost all meaning. Nothing could restore the sense of finality that had been so carefully constructed. Everyone had been reminded of a simple truth. Life is unpredictable, fragile, and sometimes even the most powerful cannot control it. For the janitor, the day left a deep mark. He returned to his duties quietly, sweeping floors, dusting shelves, and moving through the empty halls. But now there was a weight to his steps, a knowledge that he had done something extraordinary. He had seen what others missed. He had spoken when silence would have been easier. And he had saved a life. The billionaire remained unconscious for a little while longer, but the doctors were optimistic. They explained the steps needed to ensure a full recovery and began monitoring her carefully. Family members stayed by her side, some in tears, some silent, all aware that they had been given a second chance. Outside, the world continued as usual, unaware of the drama that had unfolded behind closed doors. But for those in the room, nothing would ever feel the same. The janitor, humble and unassuming, had reminded everyone that life could change in an instant. That courage could come from the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest impact. And as the night fell over the mansion, with lights dimmed and hallways empty, the quiet man who had interrupted the world's expectations walked alone, knowing that he had done something no one else could have done. The next morning, the mansion felt strangely quiet. Usually, The halls would be filled with staff preparing for the day, the sounds of cleaning carts, whispered instructions, and the low hum of security radios. But today, every step echoed more than usual, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Word of what had happened the day before had spread quickly among those inside, and everyone was moving carefully, uncertain what might come next. The family gathered early, somber but tense. No one had slept much. Some paced the rooms, running their hands through their hair. Others sat silently, staring at the floor, still trying to process the shock. A funeral that had been meant to mark an end had suddenly become a chaotic interruption of life. Everyone remembered the janitor's voice, firm and desperate, insisting she was alive. That memory haunted the room. Lawyers were called in urgently. They whispered among themselves, flipping through documents, checking details about her estate, her medical records, and the plans that had been in place for weeks. This was supposed to be final. Everything was supposed to be settled neatly. And now, the sudden discovery that she was alive threatened to overturn everything. Some spoke of potential legal trouble if anyone had moved too quickly to declare her dead. Others worried about public attention and the media storm that might follow. Meanwhile, the janitor returned quietly to his routine, sweeping floors and dusting the furniture as if nothing had happened. But the staff watched him differently now. There was a tension in the air, a mix of admiration, curiosity, and fear. He had done something extraordinary, yet no one fully understood how or why. He had saved a life with nothing more than his attention to detail and a willingness to speak up. For the first time in years, people looked at him and saw more than a uniform and a broom. The billionaire remained in the hospital under close observation. Doctors had stabilized her, and she was slowly regaining awareness. Small signs of life that had been barely perceptible before were becoming clearer, though she was weak and needed time to recover. Family members and a few trusted advisors stayed by her side, sometimes whispering her name, sometimes holding her hand. Every movement she made, every faint blink of her eyes, was a reminder of how close the world had come to losing her. Back at the mansion, preparations for resuming the funeral began again, but everyone hesitated. The grand hall, which had once been a place of calm ritual and expected grief, now felt uncertain. Staff cleaned the chairs and polished the floors, but the air seemed heavy with tension. People moved quietly, their eyes flicking occasionally toward the entrance, half expecting the unexpected to happen again. The media quickly caught wind of the story. Photographers, reporters, and news crews surrounded the hospital, hoping for a glimpse of the billionaire. Headlines spread fast. Miracle at the mansion. Billionaire declared dead is alive. And janitor becomes hero after stopping funeral. Social media exploded with speculation. And people debated how someone so wealthy and powerful could almost have been buried alive. Everyone was curious about the janitor, a figure who had suddenly become central to a story that felt larger than life. Inside the hall, the funeral service, once meticulously planned, had become irrelevant. The casket remained in the room, untouched and empty, a symbol of the chaos that had overtaken the day before. The family gathered around it in silence, some weeping quietly, others staring at it with disbelief. It had been intended as the final farewell, the culmination of mourning, but now it stood as a reminder that life could not always be controlled or predicted. The janitor, still present but quiet, watched the reactions unfold. He had no idea what the family thought of him now, or how the staff perceived him. All he knew was that he had done the right thing. Every glance toward the casket reminded him that someone's life had depended on noticing the small signs others had missed. The responsibility had weighed on him heavily, but he had acted, and that was what mattered. Security had tightened around the mansion. They had never faced a situation like this before. Powerful guests who had come for a funeral now needed guidance, and staff were unsure how to manage their movements. Some questioned whether the event should continue at all, fearing another disruption or public spectacle. It became clear that the traditional plan for the funeral could no longer go forward. The ceremony, meant to honor a life ended, was now pointless. She was alive. The family eventually made a decision. They would officially halt the funeral. Invitations were withdrawn, and attendees were informed quietly, though some had already heard the rumors. Word spread quickly through the elite circles, and reactions were mixed. Shock, relief, and disbelief were common. Some felt gratitude, others embarrassment. Many were fascinated by the janitor who had prevented a tragedy. His courage had changed the course of the day, and perhaps the course of the entire family's legacy. When the news reached the public, people were captivated. Interviews with the janitor were arranged, though he remained humble, insisting that he had only done what anyone would have done if they noticed something was wrong. "I just saw that. She wasn't gone," he said simply, "and I couldn't stay quiet." That's all. The honesty of his words touched people. It was not the words themselves, but the humility behind them. In a world often driven by status and wealth, a simple act of care and attention had made the biggest difference. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, the family began to confront the implications of the near disaster. Questions arose about the doctors who had declared her dead so quickly, about the rushed plans for the funeral, and about the internal pressures that had made everyone accept the news without doubt. Tension ran high. Some argued angrily, others tried to mediate calmly. But no one could ignore the fact that a mistake of unimaginable magnitude had almost taken her life. The billionaire herself slowly regained consciousness in the hospital. She was weak and confused at first, unable to understand why she had been moved so suddenly, and why so many people seemed panicked around her. As clarity returned, she learned what had happened. Shock gave way to gratitude and relief. She was alive, and it was because someone had noticed what others did not. The janitor's name was mentioned frequently, and though she had not yet met him, she felt an immediate connection through the act of courage. Back at the mansion, the empty funeral hall became a quiet reminder of how fragile life could be. Chairs sat in neat rows, polished and untouched. The flowers remained fresh, but their purpose was gone. For the staff, the day had become more than a routine. They had witnessed a near miracle, one that reminded everyone that life could change in an instant. Even the security team, who had spent years protecting wealth and property, realized that money and power could not prevent what nature decided. The janitor continued his work, quietly moving through the hallways, dusting and cleaning. But he noticed things differently now. Every corner, every room, every subtle detail mattered. He knew that sometimes the smallest signs could make the biggest difference. The lesson was simple, but profound. Vigilance and courage were more valuable than wealth, status, or training. In that moment, he understood the impact of paying attention, of noticing what others overlooked, and of speaking up when it mattered most. As the day ended, the mansion fell silent once more. The funeral, once a symbol of finality, was now a memory of what could have been lost. Family members gathered, reflecting on the events and the near tragedy that had unfolded. Conversations were quiet, but filled with emotion. They were thankful, embarrassed, and deeply aware of the role that chance and vigilance had played. And in the background, unnoticed by most, the janitor continued his work, a quiet hero in a world that had almost overlooked the most important detail of all. That night, the mansion was calm. Lights dimmed in the empty halls. Staff finished their duties and went home, carrying the story with them, retelling it in whispers to friends and family. The janitor, alone in the quiet space, felt the weight of what had happened. He had acted when no one else did, had spoken when others remained silent, and had changed the outcome of a life. And though he had no desire for recognition, he understood that his actions had resonated far beyond the walls of the mansion. In the days that followed, the story continued to spread. Media outlets highlighted the janitor's courage, the family's relief, and the rare medical condition that had nearly gone unnoticed. People everywhere were amazed that one person's attention and bravery could prevent a tragedy that money, influence, and power could not. Interviews and articles told the story again and again, but the core message remained simple. Life is fragile, and sometimes heroes come from the most unexpected places. Inside the mansion, the family and staff adjusted to the new reality. Plans for the funeral were permanently canceled. Instead, quiet conversations and careful attention to her recovery became the priority. The janitor, still humble, continued his work, but everyone now recognized his presence, his careful eyes, and his quick thinking. He had become a symbol of courage, a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. And though the hallways were empty, though the chairs sat untouched, and though the flowers were merely decoration, the impact of that day lingered. Life had been preserved, a mistake had been corrected, and the world had witnessed something extraordinary. And in the middle of it all, a quiet janitor had reminded everyone of the simple but powerful truth. Noticing, caring, and acting can change everything. The days following the halted funeral were quiet but tense. Inside the mansion, the family moved cautiously, still grappling with the shock of what had almost happened. Conversations that had once been about schedules, inheritance, or company decisions were now about the medical oversight that nearly ended everything. No one could stop thinking about how close they had come to losing her. It was as though the entire household had been reminded of the fragility of life in the harshest way possible. The billionaire herself remained in the hospital, recovering slowly. Her first moments of consciousness had been confusing. She didn't understand why people were talking in hushed tones, or why strangers seemed so concerned about her. As clarity returned, she learned the shocking truth. She had been declared dead. Almost buried, the realization hit her hard. Relief and fear mixed in equal measure. And then came gratitude, deep and overwhelming. For the person who had refused to stay silent, doctors explained the rare medical condition that had caused her vital signs to be almost undetectable. It was a situation that occurred only in extraordinary circumstances, one that most medical professionals would never see in a lifetime. Her pulse had been so faint, her breathing so shallow, that only someone paying close attention might notice it. The doctors admitted that the oversight was unusual, almost negligent, but not intentional. Still, the family demanded answers. They wanted to know exactly how such a critical mistake could happen. Investigations began immediately. The hospital, staff and private doctors involved in her care were questioned carefully. Records were reviewed, notes cross-checked, and procedures analyzed. Questions arose that no one had expected to ask. Had the declaration of death been rushed? Had the attending physicians missed critical signs? Had anyone influenced the process for personal or financial gain? Every answer seemed to raise more questions. Back at the mansion, the family met with lawyers and advisors. They discussed the implications of what had almost occurred. Beyond the emotional relief, there were practical concerns. The estate, corporate leadership, and legal responsibilities now hung in uncertainty. The almost funeral had become more than a personal crisis. It was a potential legal and financial storm. Yet, amid the stress and anxiety, there was one constant: the janitor. His quick thinking had prevented a catastrophe, and his role became central to every discussion. Even the staff began to recognize the magnitude of what had happened. Housekeepers, security personnel, and assistants who had been moving silently through the halls now spoke quietly among themselves. They expressed awe at how one person, so ordinary in the eyes of the world, had noticed something extraordinary. It was a lesson that would linger long after the immediate crisis passed. Vigilance and courage mattered, more than position or power. The billionaire's recovery continued, and she soon requested to meet the janitor in person. When he arrived at the hospital, he expected a brief acknowledgement. Instead, she shook his hand firmly, looking directly into his eyes. There were tears in her own, but also something else, profound respect. "You saved my life," she said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up." The janitor, usually quiet and reserved, felt a lump in his throat. He had acted out of instinct, out of concern, never expecting recognition. Yet here it was, overwhelming and sincere. The conversation between them became a turning point. She began asking questions about what he had noticed, how he had realized she might be alive, and why he had been brave enough to speak. The janitor recounted every moment the twitch of her fingers, the subtle rise of her chest, the hesitation before he finally interrupted the funeral. His words were careful but honest, showing that courage often came from small observations and decisive action. As news spread about her survival, media outlets continued to report the story. However, public attention quickly shifted from the miraculous recovery to the questions of accountability. Investigators interviewed doctors and staff, trying to understand how the declaration of death had been made so quickly. Hospital administrators reviewed policies, examining how procedures could be improved to prevent such mistakes. The story, once focused on shock, now turned toward responsibility, and justice. Family members began reflecting on the day's events. They realized how easy it had been for everyone to accept the first report without question. Their trust in authority had been absolute, and that trust had almost cost them dearly. They understood that vigilance wasn't just the responsibility of the staff or the doctors. It was everyone's responsibility. And in the middle of this realization stood the janitor, a man who had shown that courage and attention mattered more than wealth, power, or status. The billionaire's own reflections were profound. She realized that her life had been saved by someone she barely knew, someone whose job was considered ordinary, someone invisible to the world until that critical moment. She began to think about how many people like him went unnoticed every day, quietly doing their work, yet capable of extraordinary impact. The thought humbled her and changed the way she saw the world around her. Meanwhile, the janitor returned to his normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Staff greeted him differently, guests spoke of him with respect, and his own perspective on life had shifted. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, that a single act could change the course of history for someone else. He had seen the fragility of life up close, and the responsibility that came with noticing when something wasn't right. The investigation began to uncover more details. Records showed that the private doctors had relied on equipment that was functioning correctly, but still not sensitive enough to detect her faint signs of life. The initial report of death had been based on procedure, on standard practice, without the human observation that might have caught the anomaly. The combination of technical accuracy and human oversight had nearly caused disaster. Experts called it a rare event, one almost impossible to predict. Yet the implications were sobering. Family discussions also began to shift. Beyond relief, they now faced difficult decisions about transparency and accountability. Should they reveal the mistakes publicly? Should they address potential negligence? Some members were cautious, worrying about reputation and public perception. Others felt a moral obligation to share the truth. These debates were tense, emotional, and unrelenting, reflecting the deep complexity of the situation. Even the media continued to press for details, eager to understand both the human heroism and the professional mistakes. Interviews were arranged with staff, with hospital representatives, and with anyone involved in the original declaration. Each account emphasized the miraculous element, the janitor's attention and bravery, and highlighted the need for vigilance and humanity in medical care. Across social media, people discussed how a single act of observation had made the difference between life and death. At the mansion, the impact of the near tragedy lingered. Staff became more attentive, more careful, more respectful of the small details that could have enormous consequences. Meetings about policies and procedures were held frequently, focusing on preventing future mistakes. And throughout it all, the janitor remained humble. He continued to clean, to sweep, to maintain the spaces that others might overlook. Yet everyone knew that his actions had changed everything. The billionaire herself began to take steps to ensure lessons were learned. She consulted with medical experts, revised procedures for her personal care, and even reached out to staff to ensure they were recognized for their diligence. Her experience had changed her perspective. She understood that wealth and influence could not protect her from the unexpected. Only vigilance, courage, and attention to detail could prevent disaster. The janitor, though no longer invisible, did not seek fame or recognition. He continued his work quietly, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Every sweep of the floor, every polish of a surface, became a reminder of how small actions could have enormous consequences. He had become a symbol, not because of wealth or status, but because of awareness, courage, and integrity. Over time, the story of her near death became known widely. People were amazed that someone so ordinary could act so decisively. Discussions arose about human oversight, about responsibility, and about how much courage mattered in moments when life hung by a thread. Experts called it a lesson in vigilance. Families and organizations used it as a reminder that rules, procedures, and authority could never replace awareness, compassion, and bravery. The billionaire continued to recover, surrounded by those who loved her, guided by medical professionals, and inspired by the courage of someone she had never truly known. Every day she reflected on the janitor's actions, understanding that life was fragile and unpredictable. The knowledge that she had been saved by someone so humble and observant became a powerful story she shared quietly with friends and family. The janitor's life had changed as well. People noticed him, admired him, and thanked him. Yet he never let it affect his work or his humility. He knew the truth. He had only done what who cared might have done. But the consequences were extraordinary. His courage, combined with careful observation, had made the difference between life and death. And in the world of wealth, power, and influence, he had reminded everyone of the most important truth: humanity and awareness matter above all else. And so, as investigations concluded, procedures were revised and family tensions eased. A quiet lesson endured. Life was unpredictable, fragile, and easily overlooked. But one person's courage, one person's attention, could change everything. And the janitor, unseen and ordinary in the eyes of most, became a hero not through status, wealth, or recognition, but through the simple act of noticing, caring, and acting when it mattered most. Life gradually began to return to a fragile sense of normalcy. The mansion, once filled with tension and chaos, became quieter, though the memory of the near tragedy lingered in every hallway. Staff moved carefully, more attentive to details than ever before. The once invisible janitor, the man who had saved a life with nothing but his attention and courage, continued his work, but now people noticed him. Some nodded respectfully as he passed, others whispered quietly about his bravery. He didn't seek recognition, and he continued to sweep floors and dust surfaces with the same quiet diligence. Yet the weight of what had happened followed him. Wherever he went, the billionaire herself was recovering steadily in the hospital. Doctors monitored her carefully, explaining each step of her progress to her family and close advisors. Though she remained weak, her mind was sharp, her thoughts precise, and her awareness of what had happened deepened each day. She had faced her mortality in a way she had never expected. And the knowledge that her life had been saved by someone unnoticed by the world left a profound mark on her. She had always been surrounded by wealth, power, and influence, but she now understood that no amount of status could replace vigilance, courage, and care. Family members began to adjust as well. The shock of almost losing her had brought them closer together, though it also forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. They realized how easily they had accepted the report of her death without question. Their reliance on authority, on doctors, on procedure, had nearly cost them everything. Conversations that had once been about trivial matters now revolved around responsibility, care, and the importance of paying attention to those around them. The experience humbled them in ways no luxury or privilege ever could. The hospital conducted its internal review, documenting every detail of the medical oversight. Policies were revised, new protocols were introduced, and staff were trained to notice subtle signs that could indicate a life in danger. The event became a case study in medical schools, a story of rare conditions and the extraordinary difference human observation can make. Experts emphasized that no procedure or technology could ever replace attentiveness, and that ordinary people, in the right moment, could become heroes. And in this story, the janitor became the symbol of that lesson. The billionaire, now more conscious of her own fragility, requested a private meeting with the janitor. When he arrived, she shook his hand with a sincerity that went beyond words. "You saved my life," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you enough. You acted when everyone else hesitated. You didn't need to, yet you did." The janitor, usually reserved and humble, only nodded. He said quietly, "I just noticed something wasn't right. I couldn't stay silent. That's all I did." But the impact of his simple words went far beyond what he realized. She insisted that his actions be acknowledged in the most respectful way possible. A small gathering was arranged where family, staff, and key advisors came together not to celebrate wealth or power, but to honor vigilance and courage. No cameras, no public spectacle, just recognition of a life saved by a quiet, observant person who had refused to ignore the signs. Outside, the story continued to capture attention. The public was fascinated by the narrative. A billionaire nearly buried alive, saved by a janitor who had been invisible to the world. Media outlets shared the story widely, not just for the shock, but for the lesson it contained. People admired the janitor's bravery and humility. Commentators reflected on how courage could emerge from the most unexpected places, and how ordinary acts of attention could have extraordinary consequences. Social media conversations emphasized the same point. Noticing small details, speaking up, and acting can save lives. Back at the mansion, life slowly returned to routine. Staff continued their work with renewed care, implementing small changes suggested by the lessons learned from the near tragedy. The janitor remained at the center of it all, quietly performing his duties while everyone around him recognized his importance. He had become more than an employee. He was a reminder of what could be achieved through awareness, humility, and courage. The billionaire herself began to take steps to ensure that the lessons from her experience would have lasting impact. She consulted with experts on personal safety and healthcare, revised her care protocols, and even provided training for staff on vigilance and attention to detail. Her perspective on life had shifted completely. Wealth and power no longer seemed like shields against danger. They were tools, useful only when combined with observation, care, and action. Family discussions evolved from shock and anger to gratitude and reflection. They recognized the fragility of life and the importance of paying attention to small, often overlooked signs. Relationships were strengthened as a result. The family, previously focused heavily on status, inheritance, and business, now spent more time on understanding, empathy, and communication. They had been forced to confront mortality in a way that few people ever had, and the experience changed them forever. Even in the wider world, this story had resonance. Schools, workplaces, and organizations shared it as an example of how ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts. It became a lesson in responsibility, human observation, and moral courage. People were reminded that heroes are not always powerful, famous, or wealthy. Sometimes a hero is someone quiet, unnoticed, and humble but willing to act when it matters most. The janitor, for his part, did not seek fame. He returned to his work with the same humility as before, though now he understood the significance of his actions. Each sweep of the floor, each polished surface, each careful observation became part of the broader awareness that could prevent tragedy. His life was changed not by wealth or power, but by the knowledge that his courage had made a permanent impact on another person's life. The billionaire continued her recovery fully. Her health stabilized, and she eventually returned home. She moved cautiously at first, still adjusting to her regained life, but every day brought more strength. She often reflected on the events, thinking about how close she had come to the end. Her gratitude toward the janitor never waned. She realized that the difference between life and death had rested on the eyes, instincts, and courage of someone society had overlooked. The mansion became a quiet symbol of change. No longer was it only a place of wealth, business, and influence. It became a reminder of vigilance, care, and human responsibility. Staff treated each other and the spaces they maintained with more respect. Every small detail mattered, every action counted, and everyone understood that ordinary choices could have extraordinary consequences. In the months that followed, life outside the mansion continued, but the lessons lingered. The billionaire became an advocate for awareness and vigilance in healthcare and personal safety. The janitor remained humble, continuing his work with quiet dignity. The family became more attentive, more thoughtful, and more careful in their actions. And the story, shared widely, continued to inspire people to notice, to care, and to act. In the end, the lesson was clear. Life is fragile, unpredictable, and precious. Power, wealth, and status cannot guarantee safety, but attention, courage, and care can make the difference between life and death. And sometimes, the most ordinary people, the ones no one notices, are capable of the most extraordinary acts. The janitor had done what he had to do. He had spoken up when everyone else hesitated. He had noticed what others overlooked. And he had saved a life. The world recognized him, but more importantly, he knew that his actions had meaning. His courage had reminded everyone, from the billionaire to the family, to the staff, and to the world beyond, that paying attention, acting decisively, and caring for others is what truly makes a hero. And as the mansion settled back into quiet routine, the janitor swept the floors with steady hands, dusted the surfaces with care, and moved through the hallways with a sense of calm purpose. Life had returned, but the memory of the near tragedy, the lessons learned, and the courage displayed would remain forever. The billionaire, now fully aware of how fragile life could be, continued to live with gratitude and attention to every moment. She often told the story quietly, emphasizing not her own wealth or status, but the janitor who had refused to look away. And in that way, the world remembered a simple truth. Heroes are not always those in power. They are those who notice, act, and care when it matters most. And the janitor? He remained the quiet, unseen presence, the steady hand, the watchful eye. But everyone who knew the story understood the truth. Without him, the ending could have been tragic. With him, it became a story of courage, awareness, and life saved at the last possible moment. Life went on. But some stories, the ones that remind us of humanity, courage, and the power of attention, never fade. And this was one of them.